John, a humble farmer, had little more than his fruits to sell by the roadside. But a small act of generosity changed everything. A young girl, whom he had helped with what little he had, returned years later to transform his life in unimaginable ways. Want to know how his kindness triggered a surprising turn of events in his life? Stay until the end to discover how John's seemingly hopeless life was changed by an unexpected encounter. You'll be moved by the incredible transformation that a simple act of kindness brought about and how it altered destinies. Don't miss the story. John was a farmer known in his small town for his determination and courage. Since he was young, he had learned to love the land and believed that even in the midst of difficulties, hard work would always be rewarded. However, time and storms had not been kind to him. The years brought prolonged droughts, failed harvests, and times of scarcity. The farm where he used to work had once thrived, but now, with the local economy in decline, many of the fields around him had turned into barren and unproductive lands. The fruit trees, which once filled the property with vibrant colors and aromas, were now dry shadows of a past he could barely recognize. John's life changed drastically when the farm was sold to new owners who had no interest in maintaining the local agriculture. At 55 years old, he found himself alone and unemployed, facing a harsh reality. Without the farm to work on, he was left only with the humble piece of land where he lived. Over time, the structure of his house began to crumble, and the roof, his biggest concern, threatened to collapse at any moment. Every time a storm approached, it brought more than just rain and wind. It brought the fear of losing the little he still had. With few options left, John decided to try one last alternative. He set up a small makeshift stand by the roadside with what was left of his crops: baskets of oranges, some mangoes, and bananas. He knew the competition would be fierce, but he hoped that some sympathetic traveler might stop to buy his fresh fruits. Despite the relentless heat and the scorching asphalt, he arranged the fruits with great care, placing them in wicker baskets he had woven himself during his rest days. That little stand became his last hope of regaining his lost dignity. However, sales were weak, and the days dragged on with constant uncertainty. Before we continue with our story, I'd like to invite you. If you want to hear more inspiring stories of overcoming adversity and hope like this, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any new videos. I'm sure you'll be touched by this and other stories here on the channel. One day, as John was rearranging the baskets once again, something unusual happened. An old bus, which ran the route between neighboring towns, suddenly stopped at the roadside. It was rare to see buses stopping in that part of the road, and this immediately caught his attention. The door opened, and a young girl with a tired appearance and simple clothes hurriedly got off. She tried to talk to the driver, gesturing desperately. John watched from a distance, seeing the frustration and despair etched on the girl's face. She seemed to be pleading for something, but the driver, with a stern and unyielding expression, simply closed the door and drove off, leaving the young girl alone and directionless by the side of the road. The girl stood there, motionless for a few moments, as if unsure where to go. Her eyes wandered aimlessly as she watched the bus disappear into the dust. John felt a tightness in his chest. He didn't know exactly what had happened, but something about the scene touched him deeply. The young girl seemed so helpless, so forlorn, that John felt the urge to do something. Without thinking twice, he picked up a package of fruits that was set aside at the stand and walked towards her. As he got closer, he noticed her face was dirty with dust, and her eyes were red as if she had been crying for a long time. Without saying a word, he extended the package to the girl, who looked at him with a mix of surprise and gratitude. She accepted the fruits with a timid gesture, but John knew that wasn't enough. He searched his pockets with trembling fingers and found a few crumpled bills that totaled about $50. It was practically all the money he had managed to gather that week. Feeling the rough texture of the bills in his hands, it briefly crossed his mind that this amount might be needed in the days to come. Maybe he would need that money to buy more fruits to resell, to pay off an old debt, or even to ensure a minimum of comfort for himself, like a small piece of meat that he rarely bought. And his house's roof, in particular, needed urgent repairs. The storms had already ripped off pieces of wood, and with each new storm, the structure weakened a little more. That money could be the difference between a new tarp or another sleepless night, worried as rain poured into his room. However, not for a second did he regret it. He felt that this young girl, alone and helpless, needed it more than he did. There was something in her eyes, a void and anguish that seemed to cry out for help, that touched him in an inexplicable way. With a gentle gesture, he extended the bills to the girl, watching her with the serenity of someone who knew it was the right thing to do. The girl stood still for a moment, looking at him with wide eyes, as if she couldn't believe a stranger was giving her something so valuable without asking for anything in return. Her expression was one of pure astonishment, mixed with a feeling of disbelief and a touch of desperation, like someone not used to receiving help. When she finally reached out her trembling hands to accept the money, it seemed that this simple act carried an immense weight. John realized it wasn't just the amount that moved her, but the gesture itself. He saw how she held the money carefully, almost as if afraid someone would appear and snatch it away. The hesitation and surprise were etched on her face. To her, that sum might have meant more than its real value. It symbolized the hope of a less difficult tomorrow, a possible escape from the despair that consumed her. The seconds passed slowly, and John saw the fear and uncertainty struggle to leave her face, replaced by a delicate and tenuous hope. And even knowing that $50 wouldn't solve all her problems, at least she would have a chance to move forward. Without another word, the young girl gave a slight nod of thanks, lowered her gaze, and began to walk towards the nearest bus stop, holding the money as if it were a talisman. As she walked away, John watched her, his chest filled with a mixture of sadness and hope. He stood there, observing as the young girl walked quickly, almost hurriedly, as if fleeing from something only she knew. Her hunched shoulders and tense posture told a story of suffering and exhaustion that words didn't need to explain. John wanted to do more for her, wanted to offer more than just some fruits and a small sum of money. But that was all he had to give, and he hoped, with all his heart, that it was enough to bring a little light to her path. As the girl continued down the dusty road, each step seemed more confident than the last. John watched as she slowly approached the bus stop, a poorly maintained place with a worn-out wooden bench and a small rusty shelter. She sat down carefully, as if at any moment she would get up and run away. The wind started to blow gently, and John stood there, watching from a distance, as if his presence, even at a safe distance, could protect her from any other hardship that was about to emerge. The minutes dragged on, and the silence of the countryside seemed to amplify the tension in the air. The waiting became almost unbearable, and John realized he was holding his breath. He thought about approaching, saying another word of comfort, but feared that any movement might break that fragile moment of peace forming around her. He decided to stay where he was, watching in silence, wishing with all his might that the next bus would stop for her. The road remained deserted for what felt like an eternity. Every second that passed, John felt his worry intensify. What if the next bus also left her behind? What if the driver refused to accept her, even with the money? 1,001 possibilities ran through his mind, and he found himself hoping, almost praying, that fate would be kinder this time. When finally a distant sound indicated the approach of a vehicle, John became alert. His gaze fixed on the road, his hands sweaty, as if he himself were about to board. The young girl also seemed to notice, and her shoulders tensed. A small bus appeared, slowing down as it approached the stop. John held his breath, watching every movement, every second dragging on as if time were playing tricks on him. Then the vehicle stopped. The door opened, and the girl slowly stood up, hesitantly, holding the fruit package and money tightly. She exchanged a few quick words with the driver, and to John's relief, he made a gesture of acceptance. The young girl stepped onto the bus, turned one last time in the direction where John was standing, and gave a slight wave. He returned the gesture with a small but sincere smile, feeling an immense weight lift off his shoulders. Seeing her settle into one of the seats and the bus start to pull away, John stood there, watching until the vehicle disappeared in the distance. For a moment, he allowed himself to believe that everything would be okay for her. A gentle breeze passed by, rustling the leaves around him, and silence returned to reign over the small road. John sighed deeply, his thoughts still focused on the young girl who had just left. Even without knowing her name, where she came from, or where she was going, he felt that, somehow, their paths had crossed for a reason. She had appeared in his life at a moment when he felt most abandoned, and ironically, it was she who had brought a breath of hope into his world. By helping her, he felt something rekindle within him, a small flame that had long been nearly extinguished. Perhaps, he thought, the real change began right there, in that very instant, where a small act of kindness broke the cycle of sadness that had dominated his life for so long. The days that followed brought little change for John. Sales continued to be weak, and each day seemed harder than the last. The weight of responsibility and accumulating bills made his shoulders slump a little more each morning. The fruit stand, which he set up religiously every day, now seemed like a symbol of his own resilience. The roof of his house, which he worried so much about repairing, began to sag in new places. With the storms approaching, he feared that the next big downpour would take away the little he had left. One night, during an intense rainstorm, the worst happened. John was sitting in his small living room, watching the leaks spread across the ceiling when a loud crack echoed throughout the house. He barely had time to react before a section of the roof collapsed. The sound of breaking wood and falling tiles echoed through the room, and John ran to the bedroom, heart racing and hands trembling. When the rain finally stopped, he stood there staring at the hole in the ceiling for a long time, feeling more helpless than ever. The house, which was already in a precarious state, now seemed on the verge of collapsing completely. With no options, John began to improvise even more, trying to hold on to the little he had left. He used old tarps, rusty nails, and rotting pieces of wood to patch up the roof, which no longer offered enough protection against the summer storms. He dragged boards and fallen tiles around in an attempt to cover the larger holes, but every time the wind blew hard, the patches came loose, and new leaks appeared, causing the interior walls to accumulate dark stains of dampness and mold. The cold seeped freely through the cracks, and the summer heat became almost unbearable inside the house, turning it into a prison that threatened to collapse at any moment. The nights became even harder. When the rain fell, he would stay awake, listening to every creak of the roof and every drop that dripped incessantly onto the floor. John would get up several times during the night to swap out the basins and buckets scattered around the house, which overflowed with the water dripping from the ceiling. Many times, he would sit in his old chair, staring at the ceiling as if, by the force of his gaze, he could keep the structure firm. But he knew it was a futile effort. And to make matters worse, fruit sales also began to decline. Traffic on the road was becoming scarcer, and the few customers who stopped preferred to haggle down to the last cent. When he managed to sell, it was at prices so low that it barely covered the cost of continuing to plant. Over time, he had to make difficult choices. First, he sold the few chickens he kept in his yard to secure some extra money. Then, he started reducing the amount of fruit he cultivated, even selling parts of his land to get a little more cash. The trees that once provided ample mangoes and bananas were cut down, one by one, and the space where they grew turned into a desolate expanse of dry, cracked soil. Even so, the bills kept piling up. John cut all the expenses he could, stopped buying basic things for himself, and even started eating only the fruits he couldn't sell. Even meat, which was already rare on his table, became an unattainable luxury. He spent years surviving on the bare minimum, sometimes going entire days eating only bananas and small pieces of cassava to keep his stomach from growling. Hunger became a constant companion. His clothes, already old, began to tear, and he repeatedly sewed them up with improvised threads. His shoes, worn from the daily walks to fetch water and firewood, turned into rags that he tried to mend with pieces of rubber found along the roadside. As time went on, his health began to deteriorate as well. The lack of proper nutrition left him weak, and he caught colds easily. His bones ached more with each passing day, and the hands that were once strong and skilled now trembled, unable to hold a hoe for long. Neighbors saw him struggling, but they too were immersed in their own difficulties. No one had resources to help, and solidarity became scarce. John began to avoid conversations, ashamed of his situation. The man who once took pride in his work, who had never asked for anything from anyone, now found himself unable to face his own limitations. His home became a refuge of silence and sadness. The walls, which were once filled with life from the presence of friends and neighbors, were now mere witnesses to his isolation and exhaustion. Even so, John did not give up on his roadside stand. Day after day, he dragged himself to the small selling spot, carrying the few fruits he could still harvest, and set up the table with the same dedication as before. It was like a ritual, a way to fight against the hopelessness that threatened to overtake him completely. Every time he placed a basket of fruits in its spot, he remembered the reason he continued. There was a silent promise, a strength that kept him going even when everything seemed to be falling apart. The years went by, the seasons changed, but John remained there, like a rock resisting the relentless erosion of time. The challenges were daily. The tarps he used to cover the house no longer protected anything, torn by the sun and the wind. And during the dry seasons, the heat was so intense that the fruits withered before they could even be sold. John began using damp cloths to cover the baskets and prevent them from spoiling so quickly, but it didn't help much. The mangoes lost their shine, the bananas filled with dark spots, and the quality of his fruits, which once was a source of pride, deteriorated along with everything else around him. In an especially harsh autumn, a strong gust of wind hit the region, knocking down part of the structure that covered his stand. The rotting wood broke as if it were made of paper, and John had to gather the fallen fruits from the ground amidst the dust that covered the road. He looked at the scattered pieces of the destroyed stand and felt a lump in his throat. In that moment, the image of the girl he had helped so many years ago came back to his mind. Had she found what she was looking for? Was she okay? He wondered if she, wherever she was, remembered him as he remembered that day by the roadside. Thinking of her was a way to keep alive the hope that maybe, someday, life would be less harsh. The years went by like a succession of long winters and merciless summers. 15 years had passed since John had helped the young girl by the roadside. He had been 55 at the time, but now he felt each of those years weighing on his shoulders. His life, marked by constant struggles, seemed to have been reduced to surviving from one day to the next. The roof, which he had once patched up with pieces of wood and old tarps, was now in ruins. Each new storm brought with it another piece of what remained of his hope. The walls showed deep cracks, like scars from a long and unequal battle against time. The few pieces of furniture he owned were brittle and worn, and the land around him, which had once been fertile and full of life, now seemed desolate, reflecting the despair he felt. Even so, John never allowed himself to give up. Every morning, he got up, set up his makeshift stand by the roadside, and sold the few fruits he could still pick from his tired trees. Persistence was his only companion, and he clung to it with everything he had. And then, on a seemingly ordinary day, when the scorching heat seemed to suffocate even the faintest hope, a luxury car pulled up in front of his house. John looked up, frowning as he saw the elegant vehicle parked on the dusty dirt road. The shiny tires and pristine paint stood in stark contrast to the dusty, poor surroundings. It was a strange sight, almost surreal. Who would come all the way out here, to a place forgotten by time, where hardly anyone passed by unless out of necessity? A mix of curiosity and suspicion gripped him. Straightening up as much as he could, he wiped his hands on his worn-out pants, trying to project a dignity that, deep down, he knew he barely had left. The car door opened slowly, and out stepped an elegant woman, dressed in clothes that exuded sophistication and success. She had a dignified posture, moving with the grace and confidence of someone who knew exactly who she was and what she wanted. Her eyes scanned the barren landscape, and when they landed on John, they shone with an intensity that he couldn't immediately decipher. John felt a chill run down his spine. It was as if time had stopped for a moment as she approached with firm, decisive steps. He observed her in silence, intrigued and cautious. The woman had a striking presence, but something about her seemed familiar. Yet, John couldn't connect that face to his past. Years of hardship and the daily struggle for survival had worn down his memory. When she stopped a few meters away, John squinted, scrutinizing her with curiosity. She gave a soft, almost imperceptible smile and began to speak. But instead of immediately identifying herself, she asked casually about his life, as if trying to probe for something. She inquired about what he did, how long he had lived there, and in a subtle manner, sought to understand who he really was. It was an odd conversation, almost like an interview, as if she were trying to confirm something. John, unknowingly, began to answer sincerely, recounting his years of struggle, the difficulties of keeping the house standing, and the fruit stand he tried to keep going even amidst so many adversities. As the minutes passed, the woman seemed more interested in listening to him than in talking about herself. She listened attentively, occasionally asking small questions as if she wanted to verify every detail. John, still unable to understand exactly what a person like her was doing there, continued to share his story. She seemed so out of place, so out of context in that environment of simplicity and decay. Maybe she was a wealthy businesswoman looking for land, he thought, someone who wanted to buy the property for some commercial project. But then why so much interest in his story? Why such care in getting to know him? The suspicions slowly gave way to a slight feeling of unease. Why did she want to know so much? She pressed on, asking why he still persisted in living there, in that nearly ruined house. She asked what motivated him to keep going, even with no prospects for improvement. John took a deep breath before answering, feeling the weight of his words. He explained that despite everything, that place represented the last piece of dignity he had left. It wasn't just a house or a piece of land, it was the result of a lifetime of hard work, of sweat and tears shed. And he couldn't just walk away from that. Even when hunger loomed, even when the cold seeped through the cracks, he refused to give up. That land was his home. The woman remained silent for a long moment, as if processing every word. Her gaze swept over the dilapidated house, the barren land, and finally returned to John. There was a softness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Then, with a low voice, almost whispering, she asked why he had helped an unknown girl years ago when he himself barely had enough. John blinked, surprised. He hesitated for a moment, his mind trying to grasp the question. How did she know that? The memory flashed in his mind like lightning. The girl alone on the roadside, the bus that had left her behind, and the $50 he had given without a second thought. His mouth opened in a small O of surprise, but he quickly composed himself. Because it was the right thing to do, he replied simply, honestly. On that day, he hadn't thought about consequences, hadn't considered what it might cost him. He had just seen a person in need and acted. There was nothing more to explain. The woman gave a slight smile, and then her eyes filled with tears she didn't try to hide. John remained motionless, his heart pounding hard in his chest, as if something immense was about to happen, but he still couldn't see the whole picture. Then she took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and with an emotional smile, she revealed the truth. John, I'm that girl you helped 15 years ago. I never forgot what you did for me. Those words hung in the air, and for a moment, he didn't know how to react. Everything made sense now. Her interest, the way she spoke, the questions. He blinked several times as if expecting to wake up from a dream. But it wasn't a dream. She was really standing there, in front of him, the same girl he had once helped to find her way. And now, transformed into a successful woman, she had returned to thank him. If you were surprised by this emotional twist, like the video now so that more people can get to know this story. When John heard the complete story of the woman standing before him, he could hardly believe what was happening. The young woman began to recount the details of a painful past, revealing how her life had turned into a true nightmare before that fateful day. My name is Emily, she said, her voice trembling. After her parents' turbulent separation, she was sent to live with her father's relatives, rigid and indifferent people who treated her like a burden. Each day was marked by humiliation and a lack of support. Alone, without her mother, who had always been her safe haven, Emily felt lost. No matter how hard she tried to adapt, the feeling of being trapped in a place where no one wanted her only grew stronger. When things became unbearable, she decided to run away, hoping to find a way back home, to the arms of the mother she so dearly missed. But with no money and no idea where to go, she found herself wandering from town to town, surviving on whatever she could find, eating only when she could get her hands on something. In each new place, the dream of finding her mother seemed further and further away, and despair took over her. In a desperate act, she snuck onto that bus. Midway through the journey, a passenger reported her to the driver. It was in that state, exhausted and helpless, that she ended up on that dusty road where John found her. When the bus driver left her behind, the last thread of hope she had been holding onto nearly snapped. She was on the brink of giving up. But then, John appeared. He didn't just offer her fruits and money. Unknowingly, he gave her something far more valuable. A new chance to believe that there was still goodness in the world, that someone still cared. With the money John gave her, Emily was finally able to buy a ticket to the city where her mother lived. The journey was long, and every mile covered felt like a step toward an uncertain future. When she arrived at her destination, her heart was racing. Unsure whether she would be welcomed or rejected, she walked up to the humble house that had once been her home. When her mother opened the door and saw her standing there, tears welled in their eyes, and they threw themselves into each other's arms, crying as if they would never let go. Her mother embraced her as if she had found a part of herself she thought had been lost forever. From that moment on, they began to rebuild their lives together. Her mother found a job at a small local factory, and although the salary was modest, it was enough to ensure that Emily could go to school and have a more stable life. Emily, in turn, dedicated herself to her studies with a determination that surprised everyone. All she wanted was to build a future where she would never have to be separated from the people she loved again. Years passed, and little by little, she turned pain into strength and perseverance. She earned a scholarship to study at a good school and later at a university. She worked in various places, often facing difficulties, but she never gave up. That unexpected help from John was the starting point that changed everything. He made her believe that even in the darkest moments, there was a way out. She smiled as she recalled how, with every achievement, she remembered the kind face of the man by the roadside. It was as if he had planted a seed of hope within her that had blossomed despite all the hardships. Time went by, and she managed to build a solid career and a better life for herself and her mother. Life was still hard, but the simple fact that they had found each other again completely changed the course of the story. Now a businesswoman, she had studied, worked hard, and managed to create her own company, focused on supporting small agricultural communities and independent producers. But throughout all those years, she never forgot where her story of overcoming began, with an act of kindness from a man who, without knowing her, offered what he had. So, as she built her empire, she promised herself that one day she would return to find him and repay the impact that act had on her life. The days that followed were a whirlwind of changes for John. Emily brought an entire team of builders to renovate his house. From the roof to the foundations, every piece of the structure was restored. They reinforced the walls, replaced the worn wood, and painted every corner with new, vibrant colors, giving the old house an air of life and hope that John hadn't seen in years. The furniture, which had been so deteriorated that it barely held together, was replaced with new and comfortable pieces. John watched everything unfold with tears welling up in his eyes, feeling that, for the first time in a long while, luck was finally smiling on him. Beyond the improvements to the house, Emily also transformed John's old fruit stand into a small local market. No longer on the roadside, but in a spacious and well-structured place to receive travelers from various locations who often passed through the area. It wasn't just a physical change but a symbol of renewal. They built a covered structure where John could now organize his fruits more attractively and even sell other products grown by neighboring farmers. With this, the traffic along the small road increased. People from the community, curious about the new setup, began stopping by to shop, and soon the market became a meeting point, even hosting small cafes where people could spend more time beyond just buying fresh fruits and vegetables. John, who had once struggled to sell the bare minimum needed to survive, now saw his sales increase day by day. Over time, John's market began to employ local residents who were also facing hardships. He started offering work to neighbors who, like him, had been left with few options and little hope. Each new hire was another victory for John, who saw in the business an opportunity to give back to the community the support he had once received. Emily, always nearby to offer guidance and support, also helped manage finances and logistics, ensuring that the market continued to grow. The impact of this transformation went far beyond what John could have imagined. The market not only brought more movement to the road but also became a center of support for small farmers in the region. Emily, with her experience and connections in the industry, began organizing fairs and events where local producers could showcase their harvests and sell directly to consumers. Slowly, the small stand became a reference point, and John, who had once barely managed to sell his fruits, was now seen as a leader and mentor to other farmers. John couldn't help but marvel at it all. After years of fighting alone, he was now surrounded by a network of support and solidarity he had never imagined existed. The feeling of gratitude was so profound that he often found himself unable to express what it all meant to him. Instead of shutting himself off as he often had during the difficult years, John began opening his heart and sharing his story with those who approached him. Do you know someone who needs to believe that goodness can transform lives? Share this story with them and spread hope. Not everyone, however, saw the changes in a positive light. Some residents, resentful of John's sudden success, began spreading malicious rumors. They said he had been lucky and didn't deserve all the help he was getting. Some even tried to boycott the market by making lower offers or refusing to buy his products. John felt the weight of this resistance, and at times, he wondered if he truly deserved all of this. But Emily, always by his side, reminded him that he had planted the seed of this transformation many years ago with a single act of generosity. Slowly, he began to win over the hearts of those who doubted his intentions. He showed that he was there to help, not just for himself, but for the entire community. He organized meetings, offered discounts, and even donated part of his profits to support local causes. Over time, the distrust began to fade, and people started to see the market not as a symbol of one man's luck, but as a collective achievement for the entire community. The following years were marked by growth and prosperity. The once deserted road had transformed into a busy route, with tourists and visitors from other towns stopping by to see John's market and learn the story behind it. The transformation was visible in every detail. The surrounding streets were paved, new businesses opened, and the community, which had once seemed forgotten, was now flourishing. And at the heart of it all was John, who, even amidst so much success, never forgot his roots or the importance of kindness. During an annual event that had become a tradition at the market, Emily, now known to everyone as a great businesswoman and John's friend, took the stage to give a speech. She told the story of the day when a man, without knowing who she was, offered what little he had to help a lost girl. She explained how that gesture was the spark that changed her entire life and how, thanks to it, she became the woman she is today. At the end of the speech, the audience gave a standing ovation, and John, his eyes filled with tears, could barely contain his emotions. The public recognition was only the beginning. The local government, touched by the story and the impact that John and his market had on revitalizing the community, decided to honor him. During a special ceremony, he received a Medal of Honor, not just for the market's success, but for the strength, resilience, and spirit of leadership that had inspired so many others. John, who had always considered himself just a simple farmer, was now seen as a symbol of perseverance and hope for everyone around him. John spent the rest of his days at the market, sharing his story with anyone who would listen. He knew that the true lesson of that journey didn't lie in profits or success, but in the way a simple act of kindness could set off a chain of changes. Over time, the market became a living legacy of generosity and resilience. Emily, who never stopped visiting him, continued to support the community, investing in new projects and helping other people find their way, just as John had done for her. This was John's story. It shows us that small gestures can change lives in ways we could never imagine. Even in the darkest moments, kindness has the power to transform the world around us. May the story of John and Emily inspire you to believe in the power of simple actions. And never forget, as John discovered, that true wealth is not in what we accumulate, but in what we share. If you enjoyed this moving story, like and share it so that more people can see the transformative impact of kindness. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow other inspiring stories. See you next time.